Hello and welcome to the first module of the ICMI Awardees Multimedia Online Resources devoted to Yves Chevallard and the anthropological theory of the didactic. This module deals with the notion of praxeological organization. It is a direct continuation of Module 3 and will use the same example of proportionality. We saw in the previous module that in the ATD, one describes mathematics or any other subject in terms of praxeologies. A praxis block or know-how made of type of tasks and techniques, together with a logos block or knowledge made of a theory and a technology. In fact, more than a technology and a theory, it is better to talk about technological and theoretical elements or ingredients. We use the symbols T, tau, theta, and big theta to design the four elements of a praxeology. And we assume the methodological postulate that any kind of human activity, as well as its productions, can be described in terms of praxeologies. The notion of praxeology provides a short definition of what the didactic of mathematics is about. Yves Chevallard defines it as a science that studies the dissemination of praxeologies among social institutions. More concretely, it studies the conditions and constraints under which praxeologies start to live, to migrate, to change, to operate, also to perish, disappear, and be reborn within human groups. Praxeologies are not static objects. They evolve continuously, and dissemination processes are decisive causes of their evolution. For instance, in the transmission, technique scope are usually developed to new uses and adapted to new situations and new conditions. Also, the logos block is enriched with more descriptions, explanations, and justifications. Finally, it is normally in dissemination processes that praxeologies are assembled and structured into knowledge organizations. Let us look at this structuration process. A pinpoint praxeology is the smallest unit, consisting in a type of tasks and by least one technique to carry it out. When the same technology is used to produce, describe, and justify several techniques, we obtain a local praxeology. In this case, the role of technology is also to structure the type of task and the techniques and connect them to each other. Several local praxeologies that share the same theory can be structured into a regional praxeology. Finally, the aggregation of regional praxeologies gives rise to a global praxeology. Of course, there are many different ways of organizing the praxeologies. In fact, several organizations coexist depending on the institution and the historical period considered, because each praxeological organization stresses specific features and uses of the praxeologies. And also because praxeologies are historical and local productions that exist in social institutions where they evolve depending on the conditions provided by the institutions. Let us put some concretion in all these symbols by using an example. In the previous module, we saw the example of a praxeology around proportionality. Let us take the pinpoint praxeology generated by a type of task that I will call for short problems of direct proportionality. What is and what is not a problem of proportionality is something that depends on the institution considered. There are several ways of defining a problem of direct proportionality. I'm not going into details here. Just assuming we are talking about a praxeological organization that existed for a long time in what I will call classical mathematics. In this organization, there are two main techniques to solve the problem, the ones we saw in the previous module. the rule of 3, and the reduction to the unit. The corresponding technology is the theory of ratios and proportions, based on a partially implicit theory about quantities, numbers, and their properties. In this organization, the technology about ratios and proportions assembles 3 main types of tasks and their corresponding techniques: direct proportionality, inverse proportionality, and compound or multiple proportionality. The techniques were similar and could be justified or explained using the same technological and theoretical ingredients. This is an example of a local praxeology. A regional praxeology will be an assemblage of local praxeologies, sharing the same theoretical principles. We can think, for instance, in the classical arithmetic that contain local praxeologies about natural numbers and operations, fractions, ratios and proportions, measures and units, and a considerable set of practical applications. But there are many other possibilities and ways to describe praxeological organizations. Here is a raw picture of this classical mathematical organization that existed before the new math reform that took place in the 60s or 70s of the last century. What the new math reform introduced was a completely different praxeological organization that you can also see here in the figure. And today, what we have in many countries, or at least in Spain, is a blurred organization with some pieces from the classical mathematics, some things that still come from the new math reform, and mixed in a very specific way. Because there are many different possible praxeological organizations and different institutions where these organizations are elaborated and disseminated. For instance, the one that intervened in the didactic transposition process that we saw in Module 2, researchers in didactics need their own specific way of describing these praxeologies. The special way researchers use to describe knowledge, for instance, in our case, using the praxeological analysis, is what we call a referent praxeological model. Referent praxeological models are tools used by researchers to detach ourselves from the institutions that constitute our object of study. We do so to avoid taking for granted the description provided by the different institutions. If we want to describe in more detail the praxeological ingredients of the mathematical organization about proportionality that existed and also those that exist today in different institutions, we need a reference system, a kind of neutral model that does not give priority nor any kind of valuation to any of them. Here is an example of the reference model we can use to analyze the type of tasks, techniques, technologies, and theories that we can find about proportionality in different historical and contemporary praxeological organizations. You can see the different types of problems and different techniques, and you can also see that we use the notion of function, of linear function, and also the notation, the modern notation associated to the functions to describe them. And here are other possible techniques that existed and also exist today. What is the purpose of all this? To analyze some phenomena related to the teaching and learning of proportionality, for instance. We can find that in many curricular organizations, there is no clear connection between proportionality, growth of functions, measure and quantities, and rational numbers. A very important phenomenon is the lack of an explicit treatment of quantities in today's school mathematics. Many technological and theoretical ingredients are missing related to this treatment of quantities. And this affects several activities, especially those related to modeling extra mathematical situations, and those connecting mathematics to other sciences, for instance, to approximate measures and errors or things like that. Its inclusion, the inclusion of quantities, it's not easy, since quantities do not appear as important in scholarly mathematics. Finally, it seems that the isolation of proportionality from other mathematical objects, especially functions, is related to the coexistence in the curriculum of mathematical organizations coming from different periods of mathematical development. A similar phenomenon is described by the Swedish researcher Niklas Gericke in his doctoral dissertations about the presence of hybrid models in the teaching of genetics. As in the previous model, I will finish with some questions that are frequently asked about praxeologies and praxeological organizations. The example about proportionality seems easy to describe in terms of praxeologies because the techniques are rather algorithmic. What about other areas of mathematics? What about more open activities? Describing mathematical organizations in terms of praxeologies requires using some pre-established terminology, often taken from the field of mathematics. How to know if the reference praxeological model proposed is useful and does not incorporate implicit assumptions related to the descriptive tools used? Finally, are reference praxeological models the way researchers in didactics consider what mathematical content should be? Aren't there implicit values or position taking in this kind of proposals? Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon in the next module.